Thank you. My name is Leah Gazan, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. And I just want to start by acknowledging that we're gathered on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory today. I want to thank Dodie Jordaan, Executive Director of Ka Ni Kanichihk, and Hilda Anderson-Pyrz, Chair of the National Family Survivors Circle, for coming today to Ottawa to participate in this very critical press conference, because in the last month alone, in the city of Winnipeg, 5 Indigenous women lost their lives to violence and failing systems in the city of Winnipeg. Their lives were precious, they were loved and valued. And this upsurge in violence we're witnessing makes it even clearer than ever. We need immediate federal funding for a 24/7 low-barrier safe space for women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people in Winnipeg. This space that we are fighting for, begging for, would offer shelter for those fleeing violence in a culturally appropriate setting with staff who are trained in supporting those who've experienced gender-based violence. But the sad thing is that this is actually not a new demand. For over 10 years, our community has been calling for a 24/7 low-barrier safe space for women, girls, and gender-diverse people fleeing violence. Since being elected, in fact, in 2019, I have repeatedly raised the need for a 24/7 safe space. And last week, 20 community leaders and organizations called on this Prime Minister to provide federal funding for such a space. I wish to acknowledge right now the Minister for Women and Gender Equality for her contribution to the operational funding for this upcoming year. However, as noted in the inquiry, funding needs to be multi-year and sustainable. It is unfair for our community to have to beg for the resources we need year to year, month to month, week to week, to keep Indigenous women, girls, and diverse gendered people alive. It is an infringement on our right to live in security, free of violence, and in safety. We're also 3 years removed from the final report into the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. One of the calls for justice in that report, Call to Justice 4.7, calls upon, in quotes, all governments to support the establishment and long-term sustainable funding of Indigenous-led low-barrier shelters, safe spaces, transition homes, second-stage housing, and services for Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered people. And despite the Prime Minister's own acknowledgement that this crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered individuals constitutes a genocide, his government action speaks much louder than words. In fact, we recently discovered through an order paper question that as of May 31st, 2022, not 1 cent of the government's $724.1 million for the violence prevention strategy budget, first announced in the fall of 2020, has been committed. And of the $724.1 million that was announced by the federal government in the fall economic statement, $420 million that was allocated to the CMAC, and $304.1 million that was allocated to Indigenous Services Canada in the budget allocation to develop a comprehensive violent prevention strategy. Not 1 cent has been committed, not one, zero. Not a single new shelter has been funded in Winnipeg or across the country. Not a single dollar from this budget for operational funding. Meanwhile, the violence continues and families and loved ones are left to mourn the loss of loved ones day after day, month after month, year after year. They deserve justice. How many more people have to die before this government listens? How many more families have to mourn a loved one because of their failure to fund life-saving spaces? We cannot afford to be patient. when an average of one Indigenous woman per week died in our city last month, when Indigenous women are 4.5 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. These are preventable deaths that can be stopped if the right supports are in place. And I can tell you, I am not too proud to beg. I beg every day, but we shouldn't have to beg. And community leaders shouldn't have to beg for something that we know will save lives. We are not asking for the world. All we are asking for is this place, this life-saving place where women, girls, and gender diverse people can go to be safe, supported, respected, and valued. So it is my honor to pass the mic now to Dodie Jordaan, the Executive Director of Ka Ni Kanichihk.
Tansay and Miigwech for allowing me to share this space today. Ka Ni Kanichihk is an Indigenous-led organization focused on healing and training and wellness and education for Indigenous people, grounded in culture and grounded in love. And we see women every day who are targeted and at risk, and women and those who identify as female healing from unimaginable trauma. And we've been doing this work in community for 20 years, more than 20 years, with families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit community. And we know this has to stop now. Manitoba has one of the highest rates, as we've heard, of gender-based violence across the country. And as the pandemic hit, we realized and saw violence against women become its own pandemic. It reached proportions we had never seen before. Manitoba and Winnipeg continues to be ground zero for missing and murdered loved ones, as well as violence against women, girls, and Two-Spirit community. And as MP Gazan mentioned, we lost 5 women in Winnipeg in May. These are our daughters, our sisters, our mothers. This is a crisis, and I need to say it again, this is a crisis. So I ask, what are women's lives worth? When we know that women are looking for, need a safe space, especially Indigenous women, who are far more likely to experience gender-based violence than our non-Indigenous relatives. And this vision for a 24/7 safe space came from the survivors, from the women with lived and living experience. They were the ones who identified need, knowing Winnipeg was the only major city that had not had such a space and did not have a space. And those survivors and those individuals worked with a number of community-based organizations, including Ka Ni Kanichihk, to do this. These women and those who identified as female, who were survivors of sexual exploitation, of violence, of unsafe environments, they were the ones who knew that a safe space can be accessed, and they knew it needed to be 24/7. And they knew that that would change lives and save lives. They visioned providing a non-judgmental approach with culturally responsive supports and services that were rooted in Indigenous ways of being and doing, delivered from a dignified and trauma-informed approach. And this was going to be critical. And they knew that those expertise already existed in Indigenous-led organizations. Velma's House was opened a year ago, and the target was to reach 850 women, and already have served over 4,500. This space is far too small, and up until yesterday was only funded for 15 hours a day. But we are very grateful to the government and to the Minister for Women and Gender Equity and Youth for their emergency investment. This means that going forward, women can now have a safe space to access at night when we need it the most. It's not just a number, however, 4,500. That's women's lives and individuals' lives. These are women of all ages and of all factors. and those who are fearing for their lives, who need safe places to be, who need love, comfort, and security. Yet still, because of space issues, women are dying. We are here to ask the government for help to establish an adequate safe space in Winnipeg with beds, training, culturally appropriate staff, and long-term sustainable funding. We ask for this for every community in need. While we are grateful to have Velma's house, it is indeed inadequate. It is currently in a deteriorating home that was always meant to be temporary. It's been broken into multiple times. It's infested with rats. Women deserve better. Yet, even with these issues, women feel safer here than any other place. For many, it's the first time they've accessed these services and supports. Let's provide them with a safe space they deserve and show them they're valued. I ask again, are women's lives worth this investment? What are women in your life worth? What would you do to keep them safe? We all have a collective responsibility to act, and this is an opportunity for this government to demonstrate their political will in supporting where the needs are the greatest. We ask the Government of Canada to please do its right and keep our women safe. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Dodie. It's now my honor to call upon Hilda Anderson-Pyrz, Chair of the Families and Survivors Circle, to share comments.
Thank you, Leah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hilda Anderson-Pyrz. I'm the chair of the National Family and Survivor Circle. Our circle comprises of Indigenous women and gender diverse people who are family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and survivor of gender and race-based violence. I want to take a moment to recognize and remember the Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited and gender diverse people who were taken from us too soon this year, as well as those who have not yet returned home. This is a crisis with no end. 3 young Indigenous women's lives were suddenly and needlessly taken in the past month in Winnipeg alone. 25-year-old Doris Trout and 24-year-old Rebecca Contois murdered within days of each other. Only a few days later, the life of my niece, Tessa Perry, was cruelly taken in Winnipeg. We stand with the families of these women in grief. These tragedies bring attention to the alarming number of lives lost to murder and the continuance of violence, a genocide where the numbers grow each day with inaction. These lives we lost underscore the need for a 24/7 safe space in Winnipeg that can provide immediate safety and security, along with culturally safe and trauma-informed supports for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. But it is an issue that expands beyond Winnipeg. It is a national crisis. We know this because our communities are in mourning, but we also see this confirmed in recent Statistics Canada report, which shows irrefutable evidence that Indigenous women are disproportionately victims of violence. Though they only represent 5% of women in Canada, Indigenous women represent almost 1/4, 24% of all women homicide victims between 2015 and 2020. In addition, more than 6 in 10 Indigenous women experience either physical or sexual assault in their lifetimes. We need to change this narrative. We all have a responsibility to act, and immediate action is what is needed. 8 of the 231 calls for justice fall under the umbrella of human security, with Call for Justice 4.7 demanding that all governments support the establishment and long-term sustainable funding of Indigenous-led low-barrier shelters and services for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people who are homeless, near homeless, dealing with food insecurity or in poverty, and who are fleeing violence or have been subjected to sexualized violence and exploitation. Significant political will is what is needed, and financial commitments are urgently needed to address the calls for justice. Families and survivors have been calling for these spaces for decades. You know, we're getting tired. We need everyone in this country to rise with us and fight alongside of us, you know, so we have those safe spaces that are urgently needed. And it's been 3 years since the release of the National Inquiry final report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and 1 year since the release of the National Action Plan. It is unacceptable for any major center to not have a 24/7 safe space. It is also unacceptable that there remains no mechanism to hold all governments, including Indigenous governments, to their promises to keep Indigenous women, girls, and to SLGBTQIA plus people safe. Most of the 231 calls for justice are yet to be fulfilled, including Call for Justice 1.7, which would keep governments accountable through a national Indigenous and human rights ombudsperson. We must have institutions in place that are independent of governments and have the authority to evaluate how effectively all governments and institutions enact measurable outcomes and concrete actions to implement the National Action Plan. We must take a decolonized approach when examining how to ensure Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people are safe from harm, and we must rebuild nations and families using a strength-based approach. Part of this decolonized approach involves the inclusion of families of MMIWG, 2S people, and survivors of gender-based violence in this process to center First Nations, Inuit, and Métis ways of knowing, being, and doing. Everyone has the right to live in dignity and safety, and Indigenous people have inherent rights to maintain and practice their identity and culture. We all have a collective responsibility to end this genocide, and we are all part of the solution. Ultimately, we as Canadians are all responsible for transformative change on the ground that keeps Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people safe and protected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. We'll open the floor for questions if there were any.
Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah, just go to the microphone. And for those of you joining online, if you have any question, use the raise hand function. Pour ceux qui se joignent en ligne, utilisez la fonction lever la main si vous avez une question.
Ms. Gazan, you've spoken about, in question period, asking for the federal government for an answer on, a yes or no answer on whether this safe space will be funded. Have you ever received that yes or no answer? And what do you make of the answers that you have received so far?
Well, I'll consider it a yes answer when we actually receive the funding for this life-saving 24/7 safe space. You know, the former Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations acknowledged Winnipeg as ground zero for MMIWG, yet we are one of the only urban centers still without a 24/7 safe space. This is costing lives. This is leaving our community in a constant state of grief. Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals are not safe. We need help. I will continue to beg this government, but I can tell you, we should not have to be begging the government to have our right to live free of violence respected.
Yeah, and just to follow up, I mean, 2 years, what do you make of that money not being allocated for almost 2 years and not having any projects confirmed with respect to the violence prevention strategy?
Well, you know, I think it's appalling. The National Inquiry was released 3 years ago. And, you know, there's money sitting in the docket while women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA individuals continue to die. And I really think it's reflective of the normalization of genocide against Indigenous women and girls, 2S LGBTQIA individuals across the country. This needs to change, especially because the government acknowledged this as a genocide. They need to act now to save lives.
And we have no question online, so this concludes the press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci. Thank you.